On the cold morning of November 24, 1326, England watched a reckoning unfold that had been years in the making. Hugh Despenser the Younger, once the most powerful man in the kingdom after the king himself, was dragged from captivity to a scaffold at Hereford. By nightfall, his body would be torn apart, his name cursed, and his fate sealed as one of the most brutal political executions in medieval Europe. What happened to him that day was not a sudden act of rage, but the calculated destruction of a royal favourite, whose rise, cruelty, and intimacy with the crown had destabilized an entire realm. To understand why Despenser's death took such an extreme form, one must return to the reign of King Edward Roman II of England, a monarch whose personal relationships proved as consequential as his political failures. Edward Roman II ascended the throne in 1307 following the death of his formidable father, Edward I. Where the elder king had been a relentless warrior and administrator, the son was indecisive, emotionally dependent, and deeply attached to a small circle of companions. Among them, none wielded more influence than Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh was born in 1286 into a family already connected to royal service. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had been a loyal supporter of Edward I, and the younger Hugh grew up close to the mechanisms of power. He married Eleanor de Clare, a niece of King Edward Roman II, which brought him immense lands and wealth. This marriage alone elevated him into the highest ranks of English nobility, but it was his relationship with the king that transformed him from a wealthy lord into a feared political tyrant. By the early 1310s, Edward Roman II's reign was already under strain. His earlier favourite, Piers Gaveston, had been executed by rebellious barons in 1312, setting a grim precedent. Edward never forgave those responsible, and his resentment toward the nobility only deepened. Into this fractured political environment stepped Hugh Despenser the Younger. By 1318, Despenser had become indispensable to the king, serving as chamberlain and controlling access to Edward's person. Petitions, favours, offices, and pardons increasingly flowed through Despenser's hands. Contemporary chroniclers repeatedly describe Despenser's dominance in language that conveys both fear and disgust. He was accused of extortion, illegal land seizures, manipulation of the courts, and personal cruelty toward those who opposed him. Widows were stripped of their inheritance, nobles were ruined by fabricated charges, and entire families were driven into exile. His control over royal policy was so complete that many believed Edward Roman II no longer ruled England in any meaningful sense. Adding fuel to the political fire were widespread rumors regarding the nature of Edward and Despenser's relationship. Medieval sources stop short of explicit description, but the language they use is pointed. Chroniclers speak of excessive intimacy, unnatural affection, and an influence over the king that went beyond counsel. Whether their bond was sexual or emotional remains debated by historians, but in the moral framework of 14th century England, even the suspicion of such a relationship carried explosive consequences. To Edward's enemies, Despenser was not merely corrupt but morally perverse, a symbol of royal degeneration. By 1321, opposition erupted into open rebellion. A coalition of barons, known as the Marcher Lords, rose against Despenser's abuses, particularly his aggressive expansion into Welsh border territories. Their grievances were not theoretical. Despenser had used his proximity to the king to confiscate lands, invalidate charters, and eliminate rivals. Under pressure, Edward Roman II briefly agreed to exile the Despensers, both father and son, but the truce was fragile and insincere. Within months, Edward recalled Hugh Despenser the Younger and unleashed a campaign of vengeance. Rebel leaders were captured, executed, or imprisoned. Their estates were seized, and Despenser personally benefited from their downfall. From 1322 to to 1326, England lived under what many later called a reign of terror. Despenser's enemies were tortured, starved, or publicly humiliated. Queen Isabella herself, Edward's wife, found her lands confiscated and her household stripped of resources after she attempted to intercede for political prisoners. Isabella's humiliation marked a turning point. In 1325, she traveled to France under the pretense of diplomacy and refused to return. There, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, a nobleman who had escaped from the Tower of London after being imprisoned by Edward and Despenser. Their alliance was both political and personal, and together they planned an invasion to overthrow the king and destroy his favorite. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with a small force. What followed was not a conventional war, but a rapid collapse of royal authority. Towns opened their gates, nobles defected, and popular support flooded toward the Queen's cause. The hatred for Despenser was so intense that Edward's supporters melted away rather than defend him. Edward and Despenser fled west, hoping to reach loyal territory in Wales. They were pursued relentlessly. On November 16, 1326, near Antrecent, Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured. Chroniclers record that the news of his capture spread rapidly and was met with public celebration. For years, people had whispered about his crimes in fear. Now they could speak openly. Despenser was taken to Hereford to face judgment, though the outcome was never in doubt. He was accused of treason, corruption, tyranny, and bringing dishonor upon the crown. The charges were sweeping, reflecting not only his actions but the symbolic role he had come to play as the embodiment of Edward Roman II's failures. The sentence was designed to annihilate him utterly. He was condemned to be drawn, hanged, and quartered, the traditional punishment for high treason. Yet what distinguished Despenser's execution from others was the deliberate emphasis on sexual humiliation and moral condemnation. Chroniclers note that he was castrated before death, a punishment intended not only to cause suffering, but to mark him as morally corrupt and unworthy of memory. His genitals were burned before his eyes, a symbolic erasure of lineage and legacy. This act was not arbitrary cruelty. In medieval political culture, punishment was communication. By destroying Despenser's body in this manner, his enemies were making a statement about the nature of his power and his relationship with the king. He was being punished not just for treason, but for what he represented: the collapse of just governance, the corruption of royal favor, and the perceived violation of natural and social order. As Despenser was hanged briefly and then cut down while still alive, the crowd reportedly jeered. His body was dismembered, his head sent to London, and his quarters displayed across the realm as warnings. It was a ritualized annihilation meant to ensure that no one would ever forget what happened to those who ruled through unchecked favoritism. Edward Roman, too, would not survive his favorite for long. Within months, he was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his son. The former king would die in captivity the following year under mysterious circumstances that have haunted English history ever since. Hugh Despenser the Younger's rise and fall marked a pivotal moment in medieval politics. His life demonstrates how personal relationships at court could shape the fate of nations, and how resentment, when left to fester, could erupt into violence of extraordinary intensity. His death was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of a system that allowed one man to accumulate power without restraint. When Hugh Despenser the Younger reached the height of his power between 1322 and 1326, England was no longer governed by law in any recognizable medieval sense. Royal authority still existed on parchment, but in practice it flowed through a single individual who stood between the king and the kingdom. To understand why Despenser inspired such fear and hatred, it is necessary to examine how he exercised power once opposition had been crushed, and why his rule was remembered as one of calculated cruelty rather than mere ambition. After the defeat of the baronial rebels in 1322, Despenser emerged as the uncontested master of royal policy. King Edward Roman too relied on him completely, not only for advice but for emotional reassurance. Chroniclers describe the king as withdrawn and suspicious, increasingly isolated from traditional counsel. Access to Edward was tightly controlled, and Despenser decided who could speak to the king, whose petitions would be heard, and which grievances would be ignored. This gatekeeping role allowed him to reshape the political landscape to his advantage. Despenser's methods were systematic. He used the courts as weapons, manipulating legal processes to dispossess rivals. Charges of treason or disloyalty were easily fabricated in an era where royal displeasure alone could doom a man. Estates belonging to political enemies were seized and redistributed to Despenser, his allies, or the crown, ensuring that loyalty was rewarded and dissent punished. The sheer scale of confiscations shocked even hardened contemporaries. Lands that had been held by noble families for generations were stripped away in a single judgment. One of the most striking features of Despenser's rule was his treatment of widows and heiresses. Medieval law provided certain protections for women, particularly regarding inheritance and dower rights. Despenser ignored these conventions. Widows whose husbands had fallen afoul of royal authority found themselves forced into unfavorable marriages, denied income, or imprisoned until they surrendered their claims. Chroniclers recount cases where women were starved into compliance, their children taken as hostages to secure obedience. These actions were not only cruel but deeply destabilizing, as they undermined the social contracts that bound aristocratic society together. Fear became Despenser's most effective instrument. Public executions resumed with renewed brutality. Men accused of rebellion were not simply killed but humiliated, their bodies displayed as warnings. Imprisonment was often prolonged and deliberately harsh. Prisoners were denied food, exposed to cold, or chained in conditions designed to break them physically and psychologically. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not only fail, but be remembered in suffering. Even among the nobility who outwardly supported the regime, anxiety was constant. Loyalty offered no real security. Despenser's appetite for land and power meant that today's ally could become tomorrow's target. This unpredictability eroded trust within the ruling class and contributed to the rapid collapse of Edward Roman II's authority when invasion came. People who had once feared Despenser more than his enemies quietly waited for an opportunity to abandon him. The Queen's position during this period reveals the extent of Despenser's dominance. Isabella of France was not a passive figure, yet her influence was systematically undermined. Despenser confiscated her revenues, interfered with her household, and blocked her access to the king. On at least one occasion, her supporters were arrested or exiled simply for showing her loyalty. Such treatment of a crowned queen was unprecedented and deeply alarming to foreign courts. It signaled that Despenser's power had eclipsed not only the barons but even the royal consort. Foreign diplomacy also suffered. Relations with France deteriorated, partly due to Edward Roman II's reluctance to assert his claims on the continent, but also because Despenser's policies were viewed as erratic and self-serving. English envoys were mistrusted, and negotiations stalled. Merchants complained of instability, trade suffered, and local unrest simmered beneath the surface. Despenser's England was not merely cruel, but brittle. Rumors surrounding Despenser intensified during these years, spreading far beyond court circles. Tales of sexual corruption, sacrilege, and moral decay circulated among the populace. While medieval gossip cannot be taken at face value, its political significance is undeniable. Such rumors provided a moral framework for resistance. Despenser was portrayed not simply as an oppressor, but as a threat to the natural and divine order. In an age where legitimacy rested on both law and morality, this perception was devastating. Religious institutions were not spared. Monasteries and churches that opposed Despenser found themselves pressured or punished. Clergy who criticized royal policy risked arrest or worse. This antagonism alienated a powerful moral authority within medieval society. When Isabella and Mortimer later framed their invasion as a mission to restore justice and proper governance, many clerics were ready to support them. Despite the outward strength of Despenser's position, signs of fragility were everywhere. The regime depended entirely on the king's personal loyalty. There was no broad base of support, no institutional legitimacy beyond Edward's favor. When that favor faltered, or when Edward himself became a liability, the entire structure was doomed. This fragility became apparent in 1325 when Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles Roman IV. Despenser supported the mission, believing Isabella could be controlled at a distance. It was a fatal miscalculation. In France, Isabella found sympathy, allies, and freedom from Despenser's surveillance. She refused to return while her enemy remained at court, framing her exile as an act of moral protest. Roger Mortimer's presence in France transformed protest into conspiracy. Mortimer had suffered imprisonment and exile at Despenser's hands, and his hatred was deeply personal. Together, Isabella and Mortimer constructed a narrative that resonated across England. They presented themselves not as rebels, but as restorers of justice, acting to free the king from an evil influence that had corrupted his rule. This narrative mattered enormously. When they landed in England in September 1326, they were greeted not as invaders but as liberators. Towns opened their gates, nobles declared support, and common people joined the cause. Despenser's years of terror ensured that his enemies were everywhere, waiting for a moment when fear could give way to action. As Edward Roman II fled with Despenser, the contrast between appearance and reality became stark. The man who had ruled England through intimidation could not inspire loyalty when it mattered. His network of power dissolved almost overnight. Those who had benefited from his patronage either fled or hastened to distance themselves. Some even actively assisted the invaders, eager to erase their association with the fallen favorite. Despenser's capture was not merely the result of military defeat, but of moral isolation. He had ruled through fear alone, and fear evaporates when its source is cornered. By the time he was brought to Hereford, there was no constituency left to plead for mercy on his behalf. His trial was swift because judgment had already been passed in the court of public opinion. The brutality of his execution reflected the depth of collective resentment. It was not enough to kill him. He had to be unmade symbolically and physically, in a way that mirrored the suffering he had inflicted. The castration that preceded his death was a pointed act, linking his political tyranny to the moral accusations that had surrounded him. It marked him as a corrupter of the king and the realm, unworthy of remembrance except as a warning. On November 24, 1326, the execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger unfolded not merely as a punishment, but as a carefully staged political ritual. Medieval executions, especially those involving high treason, were public performances meant to instruct, warn, and cleanse. In Despenser's case, every step of the process was designed to communicate that his power, his body, and his memory were to be erased. The violence was deliberate, symbolic, and inseparable from the political trauma England had endured under his dominance. Despenser was brought to Hereford under heavy guard, weak from captivity and humiliation. Chroniclers describe him dressed in a simple tunic bearing the image of a devil, a visual declaration that he was being cast not merely as a criminal, but as a moral monster. This was not incidental. Medieval justice relied on symbolism to translate complex political grievances into simple moral narratives the public could understand. By presenting Despenser as a figure of evil, his execution became a form of moral theatre. The charges laid against him were extensive and sweeping. He was accused of treason against the king, corruption of royal justice, unlawful seizure of lands, oppression of the people, and causing discord between Edward Roman II and his subjects. Significantly, the accusations extended beyond political misconduct into moral territory. He was condemned for arrogance, cruelty, and for exerting an unnatural influence over the king. This framing ensured that his death would be understood not as factional revenge, but as righteous correction. The method of execution chosen was the traditional punishment for high treason, drawing, hanging, and quartering. Yet in Despenser's case, the sentence was intensified. He was tied to a hurdle and dragged through the streets to the gallows, a process intended to strip him of dignity and expose him to public scorn. Crowds gathered not in silence, but in fury. Chroniclers note jeering, shouting, and celebration, an atmosphere more akin to a festival than a funeral. At the gallows, Despenser was hanged, but not until death. He was cut down while still alive, ensuring that the remainder of the punishment would be experienced consciously. This detail matters because medieval executions often allowed death to come quickly once hanging had begun. The interruption here was intentional. His suffering was part of the message. What followed marked one of the most infamous moments in English execution history. Despenser was castrated before the crowd. His genitals were cut away and burned in front of him. This act was not simply an additional cruelty. In medieval thought, the body was inseparable from moral identity. Castration symbolized the destruction of lineage, masculinity, and legacy. It was a punishment often reserved for sexual crimes or acts believed to violate natural order. In Despenser's case, it served as a public judgment on the rumors and accusations that had followed him for years. By destroying his reproductive organs, the executioners were declaring that Despenser's influence had been sterile and corrupting, producing nothing but suffering. It was also a symbolic severing of his bond with the king. The implication was clear to every observer. Whatever intimacy or dependence had existed between Edward Roman II and his favorite was being violently repudiated. After the castration, Despenser was beheaded. His body was then divided into 4 parts, each sent to different towns across England. His head was dispatched to London and placed on a spike at the city gates. These displays served as warnings, visible reminders of what awaited those who betrayed the realm or abused royal favour. The dispersal of his body ensured that his death was not confined to Hereford, but echoed throughout the kingdom. Public reaction to the execution was overwhelmingly approving. Chroniclers who had once written cautiously about Despenser's power now recorded his death with thinly veiled satisfaction. For years, people had endured confiscations, arbitrary arrests, and fear. The spectacle of his destruction offered a sense of closure, a moment where the imbalance of power was violently corrected. Yet the execution also revealed something unsettling about medieval justice. The intensity of the punishment reflected not only Despenser's crimes, but the collective trauma he had caused. His death became a vessel for accumulated anger. This raises an important historical question. Was the brutality of the execution a sign of justice restored, or of a society releasing its own excesses after years of repression? The trial itself offers clues. Despenser was not afforded a defense in any meaningful sense. The verdict was predetermined. This was not due process, as modern audiences understand it, but rather a political necessity. The new regime under Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer needed to demonstrate decisive action. By annihilating Despenser so completely, they erased the symbol of the previous regime and legitimized their authority. The execution also functioned as a warning to Edward Roman II. Though he was not present, the message could not have been clearer. The favorite who had defined his reign was gone, destroyed in the most public and humiliating way possible. Edward himself was soon forced to abdicate, his kingship collapsing in the shadow of Despenser's death. In this sense, the execution was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new political order. The symbolism extended beyond England. Foreign courts took note. The fate of Despenser demonstrated that royal favourites could provoke not just resentment, but violent backlash. It served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of personal governance in a feudal system that depended on balance and consensus among elites. Religious interpretation also played a role in shaping the memory of the execution. Some clerics framed Despenser's death as divine justice, arguing that his rise had been an affront to God's order. Others were more restrained, acknowledging the necessity of removing a tyrant while expressing discomfort with the extremity of the punishment. This ambivalence reflects broader medieval tensions between justice, vengeance, and morality. The psychological impact of the execution should not be underestimated. Public violence of this scale was meant to be unforgettable. Children, merchants, clergy, and nobles alike witnessed or heard detailed accounts of Despenser's fate. These stories circulated for generations, shaping how power and favoritism were understood. The execution became a reference point, invoked whenever a king appeared too dependent on a single advisor. In historical memory, Despenser's death has often been overshadowed by the mysterious demise of Edward Roman II himself. Yet the two events are inseparable. The destruction of the favourite paved the way for the king's downfall. It demonstrated that loyalty to a ruler could evaporate when governance collapsed into cruelty. At the same time, the execution exposed the fragility of justice in moments of political upheaval. While Despenser's crimes were real and severe, the manner of his death reminds us that justice, when driven by vengeance and symbolism, can become a spectacle of excess. The line between necessary punishment and ritualized cruelty was thin, and in Despenser's case, it was crossed deliberately. The death of Hugh Despenser the Younger did not simply close a chapter in English history. It reshaped how power, favoritism, and kingship were understood for generations. His rise and annihilation became a cautionary example that echoed through medieval political thought, influencing both how monarchs governed and how subjects judged authority. Long after his body had been scattered across England, the consequences of his life continued to shape the fate of the crown. In the immediate aftermath of Despenser's execution, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer emerged as the effective rulers of England. They claimed to govern in the name of Edward Roman III, the young son of Edward Roman II, presenting themselves as protectors of the realm rather than usurpers. The destruction of Despenser was central to this narrative. By eliminating the symbol of corruption, they positioned their regime as a restoration of justice and balance. Edward Roman II himself became a living reminder of what unchecked favoritism could cost a king. Forced to abdicate in January 1327, he was imprisoned and later died under circumstances that remain controversial. Medieval sources suggest foul play, while modern historians debate the reliability of these accounts. What is clear is that Edward's reign ended in humiliation and loss, his authority undermined by his dependence on a single favourite. Despenser's shadow followed him to the end. The political lessons drawn from these events were stark. Kings were reminded that ruling through personal attachment rather than shared governance was dangerous. Royal favourites did not disappear from history, but their power was increasingly viewed with suspicion. Advisors who rose too quickly or monopolized influence risked provoking collective resistance. The memory of Despenser served as a warning that favoritism, when combined with cruelty, could destabilize an entire kingdom. For the nobility, Despenser's fall reinforced the idea that unity against tyranny could succeed. The barons who had once been crushed by his power saw his execution as proof that even the most dominant figure could be overthrown. This emboldened resistance to future royal overreach, and contributed to the ongoing struggle between monarchy and aristocracy that defined much of English medieval politics. Yet the legacy was not purely political. Despenser's execution left a deep imprint on cultural memory. Chroniclers returned to his story repeatedly, using it to illustrate moral lessons about pride, corruption, and the abuse of power. His castration and dismemberment were emphasized not simply for shock, but because they symbolized the destruction of a man who had violated the social and moral order. In medieval storytelling, his body became a metaphor for a kingdom that had been torn apart and then reassembled. Religious interpretation also played a role in shaping his legacy. Some writers framed Despenser's rise as a test sent by God and his fall as divine punishment. This perspective reinforced the belief that unjust rulers and their agents would ultimately face retribution. Such interpretations strengthened the moral authority of resistance movements, which could claim not only political legitimacy but spiritual justification. The treatment of royal favorites in later centuries reflects the enduring influence of Despenser's story. Figures such as the Duke of Suffolk under Henry VI, or later favorites under the Tudor and Stuart monarchs, were often judged through the lens of Despenser's fate. Excessive influence, accumulation of wealth, and perceived moral corruption were all measured against his example. Even when punishment was less extreme, the fear of provoking a Despenser, like backlash, shaped political behavior. Modern historians approach Despenser with greater nuance. While his cruelty and corruption are well documented, scholars also examine the structural weaknesses of Edward Roman II's reign. Despenser did not create the instability alone. He exploited a system already strained by weak kingship, factional rivalry, and economic pressure. In this view, his brutality was both a cause and a symptom of deeper problems within medieval governance. This perspective does not absolve Despenser of responsibility, but it complicates the narrative. His execution, while widely celebrated, did not usher in a golden age of justice. Isabella and Mortimer's regime would itself become unpopular, accused of overreach and self-interest. Mortimer was executed in 1330 after Edward Roman III seized power, a reminder that cycles of favoritism and vengeance continued even after Despenser's death. The brutality of Despenser's execution raises enduring questions about justice and memory. Was such extreme punishment necessary to restore order, or did it reflect a society channeling its anger into ritualized violence? Medieval justice was as much about spectacle as fairness, and Despenser's death exemplifies this duality. It satisfied a demand for accountability while also revealing the capacity for cruelty within systems meant to uphold order. For modern audiences, Despenser's story offers insight into how personal relationships can shape political outcomes. His intimacy with Edward Roman II blurred the line between private affection and public authority. Decisions driven by loyalty rather than law eroded trust and legitimacy. When that trust collapsed, the response was not reform but annihilation. The phrase horror history tried to bury is particularly apt in Despenser's case. While his execution was recorded, its most disturbing aspects were often softened or omitted in later retellings. Victorian historians, uncomfortable with sexualized violence and extreme punishment, downplayed the castration and humiliation. Only through careful reading of medieval chronicles does the full severity of his fate re-emerge. This selective memory reflects broader discomfort with the realities of medieval justice. Despenser's story forces confrontation with a past where power was enforced through the body, and where moral judgment was inscribed in flesh. His death was not an aberration, but a reflection of a society where authority, religion, and violence were deeply intertwined. Ultimately, Hugh Despenser the Younger stands as one of the most infamous examples of a royal favorite destroyed by the very system that elevated him. His rise demonstrated how proximity to the crown could override law and custom. His fall showed how swiftly that power could reverse when fear turned to fury. His legacy endured not because he was unique, but because his life exposed the dangers inherent in personal rule. Kings learned, sometimes too late, that favoritism without restraint invites rebellion. Subjects learned that even the most powerful figure could be held accountable, though often at a terrible cost. In world history, Despenser's fate marks a moment where political violence, moral outrage, and public spectacle converged. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by battles and treaties, but by relationships, resentments, and the human capacity for both loyalty and vengeance.